Hello everyone, how are we doing? Welcome back to another week of the Unstoppable Dad Project. Appreciate each and every single one of you joining me once again for this little podcast that I have going on here. Now, before I get into it, as always, I've got a couple of favors to ask you. Number one, make sure that you are subscribed on whatever podcast platform you are listening to this on. As always, and as I've gone through previously on the podcast, the audio version of the podcast will be, and for the foreseeable future, be my number one priority to getting information and content out to you guys. So by you subscribing, it means that you will be notified as soon as I drop the audio version of it. I'm a one-man band. I do this by myself. I do all the editing and all the video that I put together. So video sometimes can be a little bit delayed. But it is on YouTube, it is on Facebook. You can subscribe on there as well. But please make sure you're subscribed on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you're listening to this on. And please share it around with any friends that you think might get some value out of the content that I am putting out there. By doing that, you can help me grow this podcast and hopefully get this information out to some more people. So I appreciate each and every single one of you, especially those of you that do join us each week. Thank you. This podcast just continues to grow. It blows me away that people are actually listening to some of the stuff that I put out there. So thank you guys. I really love and appreciate each and every single one of you that do take that time out of your week. Now, enough of that. Let's get into what I'm going to talk about for the week. So this week I wanted to talk about coming back from injury. And the reason for that is it's something that this week I've had two conversations with two different gentlemen just around them coming back from injury. Slightly different set of circumstances for both. One, fresh injury, plays some sport, recreational sport, wants to get back to playing some recreational sport, has just had some knee surgery and wants to rehab everything the right way. Another gentleman had an injury 6 years ago and has never really been able to get back to it, as there is some other issues that have been caused due to maybe not doing the right thing initially with the injury, but it's just something that has always held him back. And so when it comes to coming back from injury, there are a whole multitude of things that need to be looked at. Now, the number one thing that needs to be looked at when you're coming back from injury is legitimately the context. And I know I sound like a broken record. Oh, Matt's on the context train again. Because I am, because it does matter, especially with injury. Like, with our training programs, obviously, I'm a big advocate, regardless of whether you are dealing with an injury or not, of having a program that is going to be appropriate to the context that you are living right now. But this becomes even more important when you're coming back from injury, because injury, while they may be the same injury, depending on what you want to do with it afterwards is going to depend on the steps that you are going to need to take to continue on. Now, I do believe that if you're injured or you get an injury, that you should look to be building it back up to a point where you are as strong as possible. So regardless of it's just, I want to run around with the kids or I want to go back to playing sport, I think that there's going to be some very heavy similarities between those two, especially if they are the same injury. But again, you really need to look at the context of your life, the time you can allocate to rehab, and then also what the end goal is going to be. Because somebody who is 25 years old and coming back from an ACL surgery, or somebody who's 40 years old coming back from an ACL surgery, they're going to have two different set of circumstances. And even just as simply as the amount of time that they can allocate to put into their rehab are going to be different. But also, what else is going to be different is the end goal. So where are we trying to get to from a rehab standpoint, so that not that the rehab or the training is quote unquote finished, because it, for a lot of people, needs to be an ongoing process, but how long before you can get back to that end goal, because it may be different time frames from that point of view. Anyway, I'm jumping around a little bit. Let's get back on track. So coming back from injury, what I want to do today and what I want to do on this podcast is really talk about, I guess, overarching themes that I use with people when they are coming back from injury, because specifics are going to be very context dependent. Sets and reps, exercise selection, and those types of things are something that I could definitely go down the rabbit hole on for hours, but it's kind of not what this podcast is going to be about. It's going to be more about some overarching themes that I think people need to look at, and then you can get into the context-specific stuff around your particular injury. So there's two big components to coming back from any injury, I believe. Number one's the physical side of things. That's the sets and reps, making sure that you've got all your ducks in a row and we're doing the right things to get you back to a strong physical state. That's number one. Number two is the mental side of things, because with any injury, regardless of whether it's a sporting injury, it's a non-contact injury, it's something that is just, I've had people who have been injured literally just getting in and out of the car. How that happens is another conversation, but regardless of how it happened, it's a setback. So when you have any setback in your life, there is a mental element that needs to be overcome, because we are essentially taking something that for some of us we have worked really hard for, and then we're getting it taken away from us, and we've got to start that process of rebuilding. So using our past success as a metric of our current success is going to be something that can dig us into a massive mental hole. So two elements that need to be addressed, the physical and the mental. Let's start with the physical. So when we talk about, depending on what the injury is, and I'm going to use the example of somebody who's just had surgery. Doesn't matter what surgery it is, knee surgery, shoulder surgery. As I said, specifics, sets and reps within that are going to be very context dependent. But the theme, the starting point, let's say, for example, you are coming back from surgery. The number one thing that you would need to do is go and see somebody, right? Usually the process, say, for example, if I was working with you, if you were to just come straight to me post-surgery, what I am going to probably do is refer you out to a physiotherapist or even back to your surgeon so that I can get a bit more of a rundown on exactly where you're at. Generally, the process when I'm working with people who are coming back from surgery is I look at myself as more late stage rehab. So the early stage rehab is dealt with by somebody, again, with like a higher education level. So generally it will start off with your surgeon, and then you will move on to your physiotherapist. And then once your physiotherapist has finished that early stage rehab, then you would move on to somebody like myself who can deal with that late stage rehab. So getting that initial assessment and initial guide of where you're at is really, really important, because it then helps you build a good plan with all the information. Now, if you don't have all the information, it can make the journey a little bit choppier and a little bit harder and a little bit more trial and error. There is still an element of trial and error when you're building any rehab program. However, the more information we can get up front, the easier it's going to be to get you back quicker to where you want to go. So early stage is to get some form of assessment. Regardless of where you're at on that stage, finding somebody who knows what they're doing will not only help you address the physical things that you need to address, but it can also help you address the mental limitations, because then you have a sounding board, you have somebody to bounce off, and you also have somebody to let you know what the plan is, so you know that there's a direction that you're heading in, right? So start off with some level of assessment. So if you're coming back from surgery, the steps will generally be like a surgeon, physiotherapist, and then somebody who can work with you through that late stage rehab. A lot of physiotherapists can work with you in that late stage rehab as well. There are some very, very good, knowledgeable physiotherapists who don't just, do needling and massage and manipulations. Like, they actually work on strengthening the things that need to be strengthened and then moving you back to playing sport, running around after the kids, or whatever you want to do. But then from there, if you move into that late stage rehab, that's generally where I would pick up with somebody. Now, beginning and getting back to training is going to be starting off small. So you're starting off small, but then what we want to do is we want to start to incrementally increase what we're doing in a slow and measured, controlled way. And essentially what I use with a lot of late stage rehab is just a progressive overload technique. And what I mean by that is we start off at a particular point. Generally, it's at quite a low point, and for some people that I work with, it's an even lower point than maybe what they need. And then what we do is we do that for a week or two. We get some feedback. How did we recover? How are our pain levels? Things like that. And then we just add a little bit. And when I say add a little bit, that can come in the form of a whole bunch of different varying types of intensity. It can be weight, so small increments in the weight, the external resistance that we're using, or it can be just adjusting sets and reps, so trying to get more volume done. Again, it's going to be very context dependent based off the injury, based off the limitations, and then also based off that initial screen that may have gotten done by a physio, where they have kind of given me some feedback on potential exercises that they would recommend, but also too on where any underlying issues or imbalances may be that we need to address. Because when it comes, sometimes injuries can be caused by muscular imbalances. Sometimes they can just be caused by freak accidents. If you're playing a contact sport and it's a contact injury, sometimes there's no avoiding that. It doesn't matter how well you're put together, you're just going to get injured because you're playing a contact sport. If it is a non-contact injury, sometimes it can be, there are elements of that where it could have been almost avoided. I'm not necessarily using, because there, even though you may not be getting hit by somebody, there are other external forces that come into play, but sometimes that can be addressed by making sure that there's the amount of muscular imbalances or limitations we have are limited. And when we're doing rehab from an injury, our body is such a remarkable machine that it will find a workaround to do things however it needs to in order to keep us functioning. And that in turn can start to, for lack of a better term, switch muscles off, make other muscles become overbearing. And we want to try and correct that through the rehab process, because that will stop re-injury, or it will stop other injuries occurring later on down the path. I shouldn't say stop, because at the end of the day, and I'm going to digress a little bit here again, at the end of the day, if you don't want to get injured, you need to stay in bed. Like, the fact is, if you're going to go and live life and do things, injuries are going to be a part of life. Now, you can do work to try and help minimize the risk of that happening, but if you're out playing sport, you have to understand that there is an inherent risk with doing that. So if you don't want to get injured, don't go and do stuff. But in my opinion, for a lot of stuff that you do, just in order to actually live life, like, the risk is well and truly worth the reward of what you're going to get out of from doing particular activities. Anyway, back to the point. So when, from a physical standpoint, what we want to do is, firstly, by getting somebody to help us, it takes the thinking out of it. And when it comes to coming back from injuries, it is a hard thing to come back from, especially if you have been operating at a high level for a while and now you have to try and rebuild up to that. So taking the thinking out of what we need to do from a sets and reps point of view is, I think, one of the most important things. But also, too, it allows us to make sure we've got a good, solid plan in place so that we can continue to progress and move closer to where we want to be. Doing that in a way where you will have an initial assessment with somebody who knows what they're doing, and then from there working with somebody who knows how to progress you. Generally, one of the overarching themes that I use with a lot of people when we are coming back from injury is just a progressive overload technique. And we can play around with the sets and reps, we can play around with the loading of the movement, and we do that in a very incremental, measured way so that if there is a problem as we're starting to progress, we know exactly at what point that problem is, and then we can work within our limitations without causing any large amounts of pain or any additional issues that go with coming back from injury. So that's kind of the physical things. Find somebody who knows what they're doing, get an assessment, build a program which is going to progress you, not just do the same thing over and over again for 15 weeks on end. You need to be progressed at some point, but it needs to be done in a very measured way, and a way which is tailored towards you and your threshold and your injury. And within that program, you should be looking to address any underlying issues or imbalances that may have potentially caused the injury in the first place, or may potentially cause re-injury or a different injury by not having them addressed through that process. All right, so hopefully that wasn't too much to take in. Hopefully you understand the overarching theme from a physical standpoint. Now, from a mental standpoint, mentally is probably one of the biggest things when people come back from injury, because especially if you don't have something that you're working towards, it can be easy just to kind of throw in the towel and be like, fuck this, I don't want to come back from this, like it's too hard, and then all of a sudden it becomes this spiral that becomes too hard to get out of. But there are two things that I think that help people from a mental point of view when they are trying to train their way back from injury. Number one is celebrating like little wins. And by celebrating little wins, what we have to do is we have to put on the back seat our old goals, because our old goals are from when we weren't trying to come back from the injury. Because if we let our ego take control of us as we're trying to come back from these injuries, rather than incrementally increasing and moving closer to our goals, we may take a big jump, which might be okay, but it might not either. And if we re-injure, we can go back to a point where we're even deeper in the hole than what we were if we were just a little bit more patient with it. So in order to be patient with it, especially depending on your personality type, like if you're one of those type A personalities that is, more of a overachiever and you want to push, then you need to, rather than just focusing on the big wins, you need to celebrate the little wins. And that may be just as simple as getting your rehab work done each day or each week. And then once that's done for maybe a 6-week period, then it can be like, all right, then we can start to move into some metrics of, maybe lifting a little bit more weight, doing a little bit more work. We can start to see the progress from that point of view. But the big thing when we're celebrating those little wins and as we're moving through this process, you have to treat it like a new journey. And what I mean by that is, if we're comparing our old journey, so pre-injury, and we're using that as a metric, that can be the end goal, but it's not the little win. Like that's a big win, right? To get back to our previous point. But we have to park that old journey and be invested in this new journey and understand that the starting point of this journey is when we got injured. And what we want to celebrate is we want to celebrate the movement that we have away from that previous point, rather than how far away we were from that journey pre-injury. Hopefully that concept makes sense. And it's a big thing that not just with injury, but say, for example, with new dads that I come across all the time, where they struggle to understand that they're in a new phase of their life. So their metric of success needs to be based around this journey and not the old journey. And it's just something that it's something that I think is so important coming back from injury, or whenever you have a change of circumstances in your life, you need to understand that and you need to look to celebrate those little wins. The other thing from a mental standpoint, and I touched on this when I was talking about getting somebody who knows what they're talking about, you need to understand the process. Like, where are you heading? Because if you understand where you're heading, it's easier to celebrate the little wins. So by having that plan around and have somebody doing the plan, and then as you're going through that process, you don't just have to follow blindly either. Ask questions like, where are we going with this? What's the goal for this next 2 weeks, this next 4 weeks, this next 6 weeks? And if you've got a coach who knows what they're doing, they should be able to explain to you the markers that they're looking for from the point of view of, once we get to this point, then we're going to shift to this. Once we get to this point, then we're going to shift to this. So I think by you understanding the process when you're the one that's injured and you're the one that's coming back from it, it just helps you celebrate those little wins, but it can help you stay on task because you can start to see the direction that you're heading. And then all of a sudden, for a lot of people, you'll start to see the light of the end of the tunnel, because it can be this big daunting thing when you're trying to come back from injury where it's like, I never feel like I'm going to get back to where I was. And for some people, maybe you don't. Not trying to be the bearer of bad news or be a big downer on the whole thing, but sometimes you just don't. So sometimes the injury is that bad that it is hard. However, we can reassess those goals as we go through and work towards something that means something to you as the person who's injured. But by having a plan in place and understanding the direction that you're heading in, it can make it easier to celebrate those little wins, because your coach will have little milestones along the way that they are looking for you to hit. So by you understanding that kind of gives you something to work for. So it helps you celebrate those little wins. So they're the two things from a mental point of view that I think are really important. Celebrating the little wins and understanding the process, understanding the direction that you're heading. So that's 20 minutes. It's a little bit over what I normally do. And look, I could talk on probably the theory and philosophy of this for another 20 to 30 minutes. And I've potentially rushed and condensed that quite into a smaller time frame than what I would have liked. But I've tried to cover off some really large theories in a very short amount of time. But if I'm going to recap and try and break it down into a few really simple points just to finish off here. Number one, your journey back from injury is going to be very context dependent. The sets and reps that you are going to need in order to come back from an injury is going to be dependent on the injury and dependent on you as an individual. As a rule, what I would make sure that you do, first thing is get some form of assessment from somebody who knows what they're doing. That will generally be like a physiotherapist or somebody like that, somebody who can give you some idea on what needs to be addressed and also work with you to work out where you want to go with it. So that's number one. Number two is have a plan built out, a plan that is going to continue to progress you to the goal that you want to achieve. Not just something that's going to be one program like 3 sets of 10 of these 6 movements that you're going to do for the next 16 weeks. That may be the plan that's needed in the short term, but that's not going to be a forever plan. You need to have a plan which is going to continue to progress you. As I said, I use a progressive overload technique. There are a bunch of other people that may use a different technique, but for me, it's a very measured, very slow. I shouldn't say slow, but it's a we're just adding little bits at a time when we know that our body can handle the previous work that we're giving it. So number 2 point would be make sure you have a plan which is going to continue to progress you and move you closer to the goal that you want. And number 3 is make sure you get the mental side of things right. So celebrate your little wins, and by you understanding the process that you need to go through in order to get through this rehab period and get back to the point that you want to, it will help. It will help you celebrate those little wins, and it will also help you hopefully see that light of the end of the tunnel. So thank you for listening. We're at 25 minutes now, so I appreciate you if you got through to the end of it. I really appreciate you because I have rambled a little bit on today, but hopefully it's been valuable. Hopefully it can help some of you if you are going through injury. And if you would like to chat about it, let's say you just don't know where to start and don't know where to go, you can book in a time to have a chat with me. It's a free 30-minute chat. It is, we can talk about the physical side of things and what I feel your next step needs to be. One thing with the way I coach is if I can't help you, I'm going to tell you and I'm going to refer you out to somebody who I think will be able to help you. So those calls are not to sell you anything. They are literally just to work out where you want to go. So I've opened up a bit more time in my diary over the next few weeks. So if you would like to chat, you can jump on, you can book in a time there. So thanks once again. I appreciate each and every single one of you. Take care. Have a great week, and I'll see you next week. Bye.